Welcome back to the second mini lecture about Chapter 14 in your textbook, which is about unemployment and fiscal policy. As I said with the first mini lecture, this part of Unit 3 is looking at the link between spending and GDP. So I'm going to fast forward ahead to where the last presentation video left off. So, just as a reminder, the aggregate consumption function is linked with aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is spending on domestically produced goods and services. And when we start introducing how spending affects GDP, we're going to start by ignoring trade and taxes for the time being. So just as a reminder, Y represents GDP, which is a function of consumption, which is households spending on goods and services, investment expenditure, which is firms spending on physical capital, housing stock, and so forth. Government expenditure on goods and services. Here we're not including any spending on, say, benefits or anything like that. And if we were not excluding trade, we would want to account for exports and imports. So GDP is equal to Y, which represents GDP, is equal to consumption, which we're going to break into its components of autonomous spending that households do independent of their income, plus a certain portion of income-induced expenditure. So C1 is the marginal propensity to consume, and I'll explain that in just a moment, which we multiply by people's disposable income. So that is their income after they pay for taxes. Y minus T is income minus taxes. Now here's a really tricky part about how we calculate GDP vis-a-vis spending in macro. We use Y to represent aggregate demand, so spending on all goods and services. But we also assume that GDP is equal to income. We assume that expenditure, which is the Y on the left-hand side of our equation, is equal to the aggregate income being earned and then eventually being spent on income-induced expenditure. So that's a tricky thing to keep in mind. Remember that component of consumption is endogenously determined by income. So then in addition to consumption, we also have investment expenditure and government spending. So to get rid of taxes as a problem, we assume that taxes are equal to 0. And just as a reminder, C0 refers to spending independent of income, autonomous consumption. I0 refers to investment expenditure, and G0 refers to government expenditure on goods and services. And C1 is our marginal propensity to consume. Let's start by assuming a simple economy that only has two sectors, households and firms. Right now, we are assuming that there's no trade, and we're ignoring government spending. And we are assuming that taxes are equal to 0. In this very simple economy where we only have households and firms, aggregate demand, Y, is going to be equal to consumption plus investment expenditure. And what I've done is I've highlighted the various variables that are independent of income or exogenous to our model in orange. So investment expenditure is completely independent of income. Consumption as a whole is somewhat determined by income, but a portion of spending is independent of income. So we assume that people are going to spend a certain amount, whatever their income is, because they need to sustain themselves. So this C0 highlighted in the second iteration of this equation in orange is spending independent of income. And we also have investment expenditure, which is exogenous. Now, finally, the third component of this is income-linked consumption, C1 times Y. We assume that as people's incomes rise, all else equal, they will consume more, at least in absolute terms. If your income rises, you will probably spend more. Again, all else equal. So the aggregate consumption function itself, which is an important component of GDP, because if you will recall from Chapter 13, consumption is the largest component of GDP expenditure. has, as I said, these two components: autonomous consumption, C0, and consumption that depends on income, C1 multiplied by income. So consumption is equal to C0 plus C1 times Y. The marginal propensity to consume, MPC, is the share of income that consumers spend. So we assume that people have the ability to spend a certain portion of their income and save a portion of their income after they pay their taxes. It's important to note that these shares are going to be anywhere between 0 and 100%. So if your marginal propensity to consume is 75%, then that implies that people are going to spend 75% of their income and save 25% of it. You could imagine a scenario where someone spends all of their income after they pay their taxes, and then in that case, the marginal propensity to consume would be equal to 100%. If we were to graph this visually, we would show that the intercept of our function is C0, so this is the spending that people do independent of their income. And as income rises, as income increases, they spend more in absolute terms. So consumption overall is a function of C0, spending independent of income, added to income-induced expenditure. So C1 multiplied by overall income minus what they pay in taxes. And if taxes are going to be equal to 0, then this is going to be C is equal to C0 plus C1 multiplied by Y.